Welcome, everybody. Welcome. I want to thank you very much for being here. Thank you very, very much for being here. Some have traveled long distances, others not quite so far, but thank you. Thank you very much for being here. And we're here to remember and celebrate the life of Paul Schatz. And I'm David Schatz, his oldest son, and I'll be just helping move the memorial along. And I wanted to just note that there will be a series of remarks. There should be programs out on the table so everybody can see the order of events. Near the end of the program, there will be a pause in the program where anybody who's not on the program who wants to say a few words is welcome to do so. And so just wanted everybody to be thinking about that and to know that you've got that opportunity. We are going to be recording the memorial. There were some people that were very close to Dad, especially his former scientific trainees who couldn't attend. They live in Australia or New Zealand. And so we're recording the event. And I want to encourage all of those who are presenting, hopefully I'm modeling that, but please project your voice so that everybody in the room can hear. And so with that, I would like to welcome John, my brother, to give the first remembrance.
All right, well, thank everyone for coming. It's amazing to see so many people here to remember our father, who had truly a long and illustrious life. And so I actually want to share a few highlights of his life that focuses primarily on his lifelong devotion to science, which, as you know, all three of us, his sons, followed his footsteps in becoming scientists. And it was both him and his mother's examples of their own lives that really influenced this. And I want to just talk about sort of how this, some of the things that happened to him in his career and how it influenced us along the way. I can remember once when I was in grade school, I was doing a science experiment, and just a simple science experiment with oil and vinegar, or vinegar and baking soda or something. We spilled water, and my lab partner wiped it up, and I said to him, even though we can't see it, there's still molecules of water there. And I thought he was going to be amazed by this fact, as I was when I first heard this. And he turned to me and said, well, maybe you should wipe it up next time, since apparently I did such a lousy job. And this was one of many countless experiences I had in my youth, learning that not all families sat around the dinner table talking about electrons and atoms and mass spectroscopy and things like that. Anyway, Dad attended the Philadelphia Central High School, which was what we would today call a magnet school. The best, most academically gifted students from all of the city's public schools went to Central. His senior yearbook noted his passion for chemistry that had already developed well before he graduated from high school. Because of the great amount of energy and devotion Paul has manifested in his chosen field, we have no doubts that he will attain the success his classmates and friends wish him. Dad had skipped a grade, and he actually enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania in the fall of 1945 at the age of 16. Despite being much younger than many of his classmates, many of whom had been GIs who fought in World War II, he excelled as a student. Paul, who's just a growing boy, never seems in a hurry, yet always gets things done. It said in his yearbook, he starts his graduate work this fall at Brown University, where he intends to become a physical chemist. At Brown, in addition to obtaining his PhD, he had great good fortune to meet and fall in love with the only woman who was in the graduate chemistry program at the time, a Smith College graduate from New Jersey named Virginia Margaret Bogert. He next went on to his postdoctoral fellowship at Caltech University, and I'm going to just share a few words from his postdoc advisor in a letter that we found among his papers. Dear Mr. Schatz, your letter arrived while I was away on an Eastern trip, and my answer has accordingly been somewhat delayed. I trust that it reaches you in time for your deadline. I enclose a letter to you stating that you would be accepted here and that I would be willing to serve as your scientific advisor. Sincerely yours, Linus Pauling. As many of you no doubt know, Pauling was one of the most famous and prominent scientists of the 20th century. 3 years after writing that letter to my dad, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. A few years after that, he actually was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on anti-nuclear proliferation. After 2 years in Pasadena, armed with his doctorate, postdoctoral fellowship, high-profile publications, burgeoning reputation, Dad was ready to launch his career in academia and was, of course, immediately drafted into the United States Army. Fortunately, the Korean War had recently ended, and Dad spent the next 2 years as the most astoundingly overeducated company clerk in the history of Fort Dix, New Jersey. Following this scientifically unproductive period, fortunately he kept out his feelers for positions and enrolled at the University of Virginia, was hired at the University of Virginia as an assistant professor in 1956. Nearly 4 illustrious decades followed of academic promotion, teaching, fundamental research in physical chemistry, and helping to launch the careers of numerous trainees under his mentorship. One of which is here, and amazingly has joined us, and I haven't seen her since pizza night in the 1980s. And then we also have 2 remembrances following mine from two of his people that he really touched for their career. I also want to share with you the perspective of Russell Grimes, who was his colleague in the department. Paul was one of our very first friends, dating back to our arrival in Charlottesville in 1963 as a new assistant professor. The faculty then consisted largely of old-timers with a few younger men, no women, they would come later. And Paul Schatz was leader of the Young Turks, clearly a rising star. He befriended me from the start and was a trusted confidant through thick and thin over many decades. Paul was instrumental in bringing about construction of a fantastic new chemistry building in 1968. It was with features that were nationally recognized. A few years later, Paul himself served as chairman, leading the department to new heights. Now, it would be extraordinarily challenging for me to try to explain to you the nature of Dad's actual research. And I have to admit, being in a completely different field, I have a pretty tenuous grasp of it myself. But what I did learn throughout my childhood was the way in which science works on a personal level. Every Friday night, throughout my youth, we were out for beer and pizza with his whole research group and many others who came along because it was such a famous place to go out on a Friday night, talk about science and eat pizza, drink beer, and have a good time. Countless social gatherings at our house, dinners, parties, visits from colleagues and friends from all over the world. I learned about respect for everyone's intellectual contribution, creativity, and hard work to make a team successful. He published more than 200 scientific papers in his career, co-authored a book, and was an invited speaker of research conferences all over the world. It's a legacy not just of discovery, but of inspiring others to seek the rewards and challenges of a career in science. His students, his postdocs, his colleagues, and all 3 of his children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. The next will follow nicely on that. It's a remembrance that was sent to us by Susan Pyfo, one of Dad's beloved colleagues, and this will be read by Maddie Schatz.
Susan Pyfo was a postdoctoral fellow in Paul's laboratory beginning in the late 1960s and remained one of his close collaborators throughout his career. My first encounter with Paul Schatz was as a student in his quantum chemistry class at the University of Virginia in 1967. I was a first-year grad student, and the course was a challenge on many fronts. I had spent my junior year abroad, and as a result, had missed the relevant topics in undergraduate physical chemistry, which were prerequisite for the course. But Paul was an exceptional teacher, and somehow I not only survived that course, but grew to love this area of chemistry. That spring, I joined his research group. Initially, he was pretty intimidating, but I learned that he listened carefully and was always open to another point of view. Paul's teaching style favored depth over wide coverage. He spent enough time with topics to ensure that you thoroughly understood the concepts under discussion. Then, with his background, you usually had the tools to make sense of related topics not treated at all. I knew that I instinctively followed his teaching approach during my long career teaching undergraduate physical chemistry. I am immensely grateful for the model he offered for successfully teaching complex material, as were my students. Paul genuinely enjoyed the company of his research group, and we met regularly for beer and pizza on Friday nights at a local joint. His family would join us periodically, so we grew to know them as well. He passed on his love of science to his children, all of whom chose careers in scientific fields. That is uncommon, and the country is better for it. After I received my PhD in 1970, Paul and I continued to collaborate for many years. I spent most of my career as a professor of chemistry at Sweetbriar College, where my husband was a professor of English. Since my role in the Schatz group was the theoretical interpretation of results, I could do that at a distance. Initially, we worked on MCD, magnetic circular dichroism data for high symmetry complexes. Thank you. That led to our mutual interest in group theory. Eventually, we published a book together called Group Theory in Spectroscopy. After that, we collaborated on a number of papers on the theoretical interpretation of data and mixed valence compounds. We meshed well, and working together was easy. I only once visited Paul at Evergreen Woods, but it was obvious that he had become a valued member of that retirement community. We kept in touch through the exchange of lengthy holiday letters. After so many years, it is hard to believe that Paul is gone. I salute a life well lived. I know his spirit continues through his descendants and the many students, colleagues, and friends he mentored throughout his long life. I deeply regret not being able to join you in person for this celebration of a life well lived.
So I just wanted to say at the end of the memorial there will be a short quiz. If you don't know what a mixed valence compound is and a little bit about spectroscopy, I'm afraid you're not going to do well on this particular quiz. But we will still allow you to have some snacks and drinks and things like that. So, yeah. So our next remembrance is also from a former trainee and colleague of Dad's by the name of Bryce Williamson. And this is going to be read by Paul Schatz. Now this is not reincarnation quite yet, but this is another one of his grandchildren. Paul?
Bryce Williamson was a postdoctoral fellow with Paul in the mid-1980s. I first learned about Paul Schatz in early 1983 from Elmas Krauss, who was a research fellow at the Australian National University where I was doing a PhD. Elmas had done a postdoctoral fellowship with Paul and said Paul was an excellent scientist and also a great bloke, and that he could see the two of us getting along very well together. I applied for a position and was successful. In retrospect, this was a critical milestone in my life and was to have a hugely formative influence on the enjoyable and fulfilling career from which I have recently retired. I also got to meet one of the best friends of my life. Wendy and I arrived in Charlottesville in May 1983 with our 15-month-old daughter, Adele. Paul gave me the responsibility of overseeing a research laboratory populated by diligent and intelligent PhD students. The two of us spent long hours in Paul's office using a whiteboard to sketch and scheme, lateral thinking about strange and unexpected experiment results, bullet point drafts of papers, ways in which to unravel and revive projects, possible projects for future funding rounds. This was a thrilling intellectual experience for me, formative training that was seminal to my transition from research student to research leader. Paul's contribution to Wendy's, Adele's, and my Charlottesville experience was not limited to research. Paul and Ginny assumed effective roles as grandparents to Adele, lending us toys and provided other pre-loved items. Joined by postdocs and graduate students from other research teams who attached themselves to Paul's outgoing social group, he and Ginny hosted convivial Friday beer and pizza evenings at a nearby establishment where Adele frolicked around on the linoleum floor to tunes from the jukebox. We went for dinner parties at the Schatz residence and spent afternoons at their place watching the Super Bowl and other sporting events or celebrating various cultural occasions. Paul was an avid and perceptive sports fan who taught me a lot about American sport. Paul was a very caring person with steadfast ethics and a moral fortitude that engendered him in a strong leaning towards liberal political thought. Perhaps the only aspect of contentment that I derive from Paul's death is his release from the anguish that he surely would have felt due to many of the political and politically influenced happenings that are currently afflicting our societies and planet. It saddens me that we lived too far apart to have met more often, and it saddens me even more deeply that I will never again have a chance to see him or talk to him. But he will always remain strong in my mind, even if or as my memory fades. In Te Reo Maori, the language of New Zealand's first people, one would say, "E totara nui kua hinga," a great totara tree has fallen. Thank you.
Our next remembrance will come from my brother, Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm the middle brother. I'm going to be maybe a little more serious today. I spent a lot of time on the phone with my dad in recent years, just talking about stuff. He would send me an email or a text suggesting 4 p.m. on Sundays, unless, of course, it conflicted with a game from his beloved Philadelphia Eagles. I'm sure there's a few fans here. So he would never interrupt those. We spent a lot of time talking about, the basics of daily living, especially in the last couple of years, discussing health issues, reminding him how to do stuff on his even more beloved computer and iPhone. But every conversation also gave me a chance to really learn from the profound wisdom about how to live a good life. He had spent some years in psychoanalysis, and he actually sort of became my analyst without the hourly fees, which helped, when I was going through some tough times in my personal and professional life. And, that was really appreciated. He helped me to understand sort of how I felt about things, and he also helped me think about things sort of logically and carefully. And the key to his understanding of life is that you can't ignore your emotions, nor can you think only with cold logic. You have to sort of bring those two things together in order to be a good person and to live a good life. His wisdom about people helped him make and keep friends from all walks of life and from many places around the world. In helping him monitor his email in recent years, I saw messages come in from the UK, Australia, New Zealand. You're hearing from some of those people already today, and you'll hear from more of them. Friends from all walks of life, many different ages. He really connected with people. Almost every time in our conversations, we would come around to the what's going on stage. From his earliest years to his last weeks, he was deeply concerned about what was happening around the US and around the world. He had a fierce belief that it's our duty as humans to do things pretty much every day to make the world a little bit better rather than a little bit worse. Not only for the people, but also for the sort of amazing diversity of other living things that share our fragile planet. One of my jobs in recent years was to help him manage his finances, And in the early years of that, he was donating many thousands of dollars to dozens of causes every year, all really focused on making the world better. And as the expenses increased and the funds started to dwindle, I had to try to talk him down from that, but it wasn't easy because he really felt strongly to the last days that he should be doing something, even if he could only sit in a chair and type on a computer and, send funding to help people do things. His opinions about what was going on in the world were informed by two things that seemed to be increasingly rare in many countries, including this one. First, that you need to start by being well informed by facts supplied by reliable sources, and opinions shared by actual experts, not just people who have Facebook accounts. Second, that you need to think critically about those facts and opinions, always keeping in mind that the real world exists in shades of gray, not in simple black and white informed by rigid ideologies. As an example, he was a firm supporter of the state of Israel, but was also deeply critical of actions taken by right-wing Israelis, particularly in the wake of the 1967 war, that made it very difficult for the multiple indigenous peoples, Jews, Palestinians, and others, to live side by side in peace in a land considered holy by multiple religious faiths. He had similarly complex views about strategic mistakes made by other parties to this conflict. The possible solutions that have been thrown around and that he and I discussed and supported many times have not been implemented. We see the tragic results every day in the news. My father was deeply patriotic in spite of the shameful way that he and his family were treated in the 1940s and 1950s, including when he was in the army, by a country gripped by paranoia. He expressed that patriotism by supporting national and local causes based in the highest ideals of this country: freedom, equality, and tolerance. He supported our mom's forays into local politics as a member of the Charlottesville, Virginia Planning Commission and then school board. Some of my earliest memories of music in our home are listening to songs coming out of the civil rights movement, and also laughing nervously at the biting and very insightful political satire of Tom Lehrer. Many of you may have heard before. In some ways, I'm glad he didn't live to see this moment in U.S. history, as somebody else mentioned, as the spawn of Roy Cohn and Joseph McCarthy take power again in this country. But if he was alive today, he would be fighting back. Not with uncontrolled anger and violence, because that's what they want us to do, okay? He would be fighting back by thoughtful support of people and organizations, demanding a return to the ideals that this country should represent. I am proud to be his son, and I hope that I can honor his legacy of living a life that improved a troubled world. If I sound a bit angry today, it's because I am about what's going on. But if I learned nothing else from my dad, he taught me to channel that energy into doing something constructive, so that maybe we can all make the world a bit better. Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. There's just so much to think and to say and to reflect on. Our next remembrance is from Alec Kercheval. He was a good friend of the family, and it will be read by grandchild Anna Kate Schatz.
Alec Kercheval is a friend of David's from their postgraduate time together. Thank you for this opportunity to contribute these few words to Paul's memorial service. I met Paul Schatz in the summer of 1982 at Lazy Days on Fire Island as I was turning 24 years old. In the prior 2 years, I had become friends with David at Oxford, and at the end of our studies, a group of us planned a glorious 5-day sail back across the Atlantic on the QE2, the conquering heroes returning after vanquishing our final examinations. At the last minute, Her Majesty's government requisitioned the QE2 for the Falklands War, forcing us to exchange our triumphant cruise for economy flights. Faced with this setback, David proposed to invite the group of us, including some in this room, to spend a few days instead at his family's summer beach retreat in Ocean Beach, Fire Island. This began a sequence of rejuvenating annual or biannual summer reunions at Ocean Beach that lasted, for me, more than 20 years. Paul and Ginny were two centers of gravity in that house, he often surrounded by his Apple computer gear, with a mind inquisitive in all directions, a sharp sense of humor, and quick with a witty reply. Lillian and I often quoted his exclamation when, at breakfast, he first saw our then plump and well-fed 8-month-old daughter Claire. "Quick, somebody feed that baby." Since I myself was effectively raised by a single mother, it was inspiring to be a brief and occasional part of what seemed to me to be a healthy family with two engaged parents. Paul vividly demonstrated what an engaged father could be like, simply by connecting in a loving and supportive way with those around him. This, along with the rest of the family and the many friends who gathered there over the years, helped make my visits to Fire Island a tonic I didn't know I needed. Paul, it was inspiring to know you, and I thank you and Ginny and the whole family for welcoming me during our summer visits. You were a great and wonderful man I will never forget.
Thank you, Annie Kate. I think we're going to continue along some of these similar themes, and our next remembrance will come from a friend, Boris Axberg.
I'm Boris Axberg, and I am one of that same mob that Alec Kirchwald just described. Met in England and then began repeated series of visits to Fire Island. And remarkably, Paul and Ginny did not tell the ferry crew to keep us off, which demonstrates their serious generosity of spirits to let the chaos people that we were repeatedly to come to the island in spite of knowing what was going to happen. I'm going to begin here by reading an email from my daughter, Siri, who gave a little remembrance herself of her time. So this is Siri's words. And no, she's not the Apple upgrade. I have to put in that disclaimer because she keeps getting accused of being named after. And no, she's 32 years old. It's all right. Every summer on Fire Island was pure magic. Stepping into a world that made us rambunctious kids and adults. No cars, just golf carts, and the occasional herd of deer who would watch us watch them. When we weren't spending hours at the beach, we were waging epic water battles against wicked Uncle Scott, who I will point out in the back of the room, for those of you who want to have tips and pointers on how to smuggle large industrial extinguishers through TSA checkpoints. Oh, that was my outside voice, I'm sorry. Speaking of adults, our nerdy crew, this is Siri again, my daughter saying this. Speaking of adults, our nerdy crew of grown-ups spent time huddled around tables, poring over Dungeons and Dragons manuals, rolling dice and playing make-believe. Yeah, our kids noticed, yeah. Thank you, Paul, for being the glue and the backbone and the springboard for all our happy memories. I'll be searching for a swinging couch as comfortable as the one on your Lazy Days porch for the rest of my life. So now a couple of things that I recall as well. Arriving at Fire Island, and some of you have been there was always the ferry ride, wind through your hair. There were wagons at the dock, which is how you moved your goods inland. As you arrived, there was the wave, where people who were already there would come out on the dock and give you a wave and a wolf howl to greet you, much to the consternation of the ferry's staff, who were wondering what was about to happen. There was a walk, no cars, to the house. And you arrived at this aged, lovely summer house. And like the TARDIS, it was much larger on the inside than the outside. I remember never getting upstairs until several years into our visits and discovering a vast vista of bedrooms. That I always wondered where everybody went when they went upstairs. How could they all fit? We had every summer, there was an inaugural summer water fight with various escalations. Scott. And there were rules that developed out of this. I think Paul was primary, for example. No using the hose through the screen doors into the house. Basic stuff, but important to get clarity around. Mornings were slow. There were bagel runs, New York Times acquisitions, slow brunch. Somewhere in the afternoon, the cry, "Go Beach," would come up, and there would be decisions about how to get out there. Games would be had, paddleball, "No Way Man" was a classic game some of us played. Body surfing, beached whale-like naps on the beach, hosing off the sand when you came back, very strict rule about hosing off the sand. Lovely long showers, and then major dinner preparations for this mob of people with a joint feast together, of which there are some images and photographs that are legendary. And songs that were sung, some of which cannot be done in polite company, and I won't even attempt to start one of those now. Wines and port, and then a dishwashing frenzy. In some ways, before the advent of a machine dishwasher, there was an incredibly fun set of events around wet sponges being thrown, water going places, dishes, and Paul was master of that ceremony. Ice cream runs, and then, yes, Dungeons and Dragons until the wee hours. And Paul was in the middle of all of this, with his floppy hat, his guileless, great, huge smile, easy grin, his infectious, full-throated laugh. You just had to smile when you heard that laugh echo throughout the house. Computer geek, as somebody else mentioned, stuck to his Macs in the corner. Some of the photographs are of really old hardware. It's pretty impressive. Gin and tonics in hand, often made by Graham Light from England, who's back there, and then eventually by his sons, who were superb at making gins and tonics in the late afternoon. His morning focus on the New York Times, as has been heard, to fuel discussions as his own thinking. Beach chairs were at the ready. He knew how to set up on the beach. He had that down. And then he was head of the dinner table. He was always at the top of the dinner table, led the discussions and the chaos, the dishwashing. He was a history keeper and a storyteller, and just a fount of never-failing generosity. So now I imagine him he caught the last ferry to Fire Island. He's swinging on that amazing porch swing. He's digging into the news and bagels. Ginny at his side, always. The beach chairs are waiting use. He's awaiting the insanity of the eventual visits from his friends and family. We will all get there. Paul, we're there with you in our dreams and memories and hearts. As a result, we really haven't lost you, even though we miss you terribly.
My ever-prescient wife encouraged me to have a Kleenex or two in my pocket. So that was good advice. Thank you, Bill. That touched on some very, very special moments. Our next remembrance comes from another member of this interesting crew, Gary Lawrence, and his remarks will be read by Claudia Schatz, grandchild.
Go Birds! Yes! I'm wearing this in honor of my Grandpa Paul, who never missed a game as far as I know in the last couple years, and would be happy to watch them play tonight. Gary Lawrence is a friend of David's from their undergraduate and postgraduate time together. How much fun were those lazy days on Fire Island? The water fights, the cocktails, the debate, the beach, with and without bathing suits, all by the good graces of your mom and dad. And your dad's flash dance Jennifer Beals impersonation on the Fire Island Strip will remain forever etched in stone in my memory, for better or for worse. Your dad and mom were brilliant, both intellectually and in spirit. This is what I will always remember. Soon and I were also blessed to be annual recipients of your dad's well wishes, as he always responded to our annual Lunar New Year family missive, and then added on an update on his activities. He was so filled with energy and so proud of his children and grandchildren. His energy and humor will be missed, and we can only hope to follow this lead as our knees, hips, etc. start to give out. We wish you a weekend of warmth, reflection, and memories, and sharing among friends.
And I might just take a moment to expound on that reference in Gary's remarks to Jennifer Beal and Flashdance.
Can you show us?
I'm not appropriately or quite dressed properly to show, but I don't know how many people remember Flashdance, but it triggered a new fashion where people would wear one shoulder of their garment sort of pulled down, exposing their bare shoulder. And
It looked better on some than others.
it definitely did. And there was one evening we had I think a pretty raucous dinner and quite a bit to drink, and we went down into town in Ocean Beach. It was a very small, just a big long strip of shops and a sidewalk. And we had gotten our ice cream. We were sitting just on the stones, just on the watching people go by. And because of this new fashion, a fair fraction of the young women walking by had one shoulder exposed in the typical Jennifer Beal fashion. And my dad, he was well lubricated at this point. They would go by and he sort of had this stern look on his face, and then just as their backs receded from him, he would turn to them and give this big smile. And he would pull one shoulder and just to their receding back, and then the next person, he'd pull it back up again. It was just, this was not typical behavior of my father. And so watching him do this was really, we were all just collapsing in laughter. In any case, so that's we're gonna go into that backstory, but we will skip the part about swimming without bathing suits. Okay, our next remembrance will come from Zoe Donnell.
Hello, I am Zoe Donnell, a friend.
Zoe, could you come up into the front? Is that okay?
Sure.
But I like the idea of just wherever.
Wherever we are. I'm Zoe. I'm a friend of Paul's late in his life. It's wonderful to hear all of these stories, some of which I've heard a little bit about, of the fun and foibles of the beach house. But for my part, I was a friend late in his life. And when my husband and I first moved here, bear with me a little bit, it's a little bit of Evergreen history. We were not computer people, but we had to have computers. And Paul and Bill Goldberg and a couple of other people were generous-hearted, not surprising, to come and help us. So Paul was the one to come and help us, and he did. So that was where we first met Paul. It was a wonderful first meeting. We got a good feel for the warmth and humanity in the man, which was certainly true. There was a group, in addition to that pleasure, there was a group of us who went up to Hartford for a theater experience. Theater Works, it was called. Wonderful, edgy, fun theater, and beautiful supper ahead of time, at a restaurant whose name I've totally forgotten. But it doesn't matter the name, but it was wonderful food, wonderful wine, just grand time, just reflective in a lot of ways of what you're all talking about, a good time, and we had it. This group was a big group to begin with. It shrunk over time, as groups do, and finally there were just Paul and 3 other women, myself included, that were left over from the theater group. So we had supper together, the 4 of us occasionally, which was fun and good, and he was hilarious. He told funny stories on himself, he entertained us, he brought out funny stories from us, he opened the door so that we could tell funny stories on ourselves. It was such fun. He was just plain fun, and yet he was such a serious man. It was always kind of a, whoa, look at this. This is a funny man, and wonderful, big-hearted, just a sweet and dear person. The group broke up after a while, and Paul asked if I would like to have dinner with him on one night a week. So we chose Wednesday night, and we had every Wednesday night. He made arrangements with the dining room, and we had our dinner in the same place in the dining room all through the next bit of time till unfortunately, he fell. And that was followed by another fall, and that was really, as we all know, the beginning of the end. But in the meantime, before the fall, we had wonderful conversations. He, as you all know, he was so smart, but he was also very kind, and he never talked down to a person. He never made out that he was so super smart. He was, but he never gave off that. So we had wonderful conversations, really insightful. We talked about our parents, we talked about our lives growing up, we talked about our college experiences, and I've always been interested in science, but I'm certainly not knowledgeable in any degree that's measurable according to what he knew. But he was never condescending, never looked down on you, never talked down on you. He was open and generous and sharing. So we had wonderful conversations. He read widely, fiction as well as nonfiction. So we had that in common, and we read a lot of the same books together, and so that was a good part of the conversation. It was after the, well, I know, I want to say one other thing about the theater. He was, he was so gallant, he was so gracious, and I never did have a chance to meet Jenny. She was gone by the time we had moved here. Paul and Jenny had moved here several years before we did, but I did meet Laura Fisher. And Laura was a lovely, lovely, gracious, extremely quiet until she wasn't. She could be funny too. She was part of the dinner group that went together. But after she died, it was kind of a gap for Paul. It was a lonesome time, I feel pretty sure. And it was quite a long time before I got into the picture and before my good friend to my side here got into the picture. And so I mentioned Laura just because that was such a sweet and tender bit in his life. Let's see, I should have brought my notes. I'm going to forget something, no doubt. But through all of those dinners and all of those good conversations and all of that good-hearted, warm time, at the end of the evening, Paul would give me a peck on the cheek and say, "Remember, don't fall." This was all during COVID, so we were all masked up like this, so we could barely understand each other most of the time. But we managed. But he would always say, "Now remember, don't fall," and that's a good bit of advice for all of us. He was fun. He was interesting, he was charming, he was the best gentleman you could ever hope to know, and I am missing him like crazy.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Our next remembrance will come from another good friend of Paul's here at Evergreen Woods, Tony Tyndall.
Hi, Tony Tyndall. I am not going to attempt to review the enormous contributions that Paul made to life here at Evergreen, except, and this is a horse I beat all the time, and I thought I would be talking to mostly Evergreen residents and reminding them, but I guess I'll have to tell you that one of our tools of getting to know each other and being a community was a picture directory. Paul conceived that picture directory and did 97.3% of the work of bringing it out year after year after year, and graciously handed it over to Terry, so it will continue, fortunately. I'm also not going to relate the many, many wonderful stories I've heard about life in Charlottesville and at Lazy Days, although there's one story I can't resist. It involved Ginny and Fred, spelled P-H-R-E-D, of course. Fred was a cat. This story also involved a very unlucky rabbit, and it also involved a hockey stick. That's all I'm going to say about it now. I had the great good fortune of moving across the hall, I should say, into Evergreen 9 years ago, across the hall from Laura, which is how I got involved in the Paul and Laura circuit, which, once again, talk about luck. Being a friend of Paul's for 9 years, I've been here a while, was probably one of the most wonderful, or one of the very wonderful things of my life. Thanks.
I'm actually not an expert on the Fred, Ginny, hockey stick story. Did any? Do you know it well?
I know it well.
Would you like to tell it for us right now?
Well, yeah, I don't remember the hockey stick part. Maybe it's a different story.
The hockey stick was how
There was a number of incidents with, so we got cats actually from Robert and Judy when I was in, I think, the 4th grade. And we hadn't had cats before, but we always loved them. And so we had cats, and they used to be indoor-outdoor cats. And we eventually put because we lived right on a big open wooded area, it's quite safe to give them their own little cat door. Once they figured out how to use it, that was great. They came and go as they went, but they also would bring in their prey to the house. And so there was, and it's not necessary for the faint of heart, but there was a nest of baby bunnies that the cats discovered, and they brought the baby bunnies in one at a time. In various states of being alive. That didn't last long. And then eventually the mother bunny got fed up with this situation and followed the cats in. And so the incident I remember was Mom running around the basement, 2 cats, a barely alive baby bunny, and a very angry mother bunny, all in a big circus. And I was still relatively young at the top of the stairs saying, Mom, what can I do? And she just slammed the door and said, I'll deal with it.
I have to add the other details. Your mom got the rabbit away from Fred, threw it out the front door. Fred went down out your door and caught it again.
That's right. That's right. There's more than one story. I think.
I'm sure.
And you should also understand that the rabbits running around the house was in the context of anywhere between, say, 12 and 32 snakes.
Oh yes.
That lived in our house. They were not free most of the time. They were not free. They were in cages, but our parents were also extremely generous in being willing to sort of support our.
Well, I understand your mom was known as the Snake Lady of Charlottesville.
She was Mom was known as the Snake Lady of Charlottesville. She would take snakes to local elementary and junior high schools and try to introduce people to snakes and reduce their fear of them. And Mom was also a brilliant scientist. So, okay, so we're at the part of the program where I would love to invite people to say a few words who aren't on the program. So please, we have our first speaker here, and introduce yourself, and please.
Oh,
Tony just introduced me. I'm Terry Aiken, and I've lived here almost 2 years. And one of the first things that came to me was how wonderful the photo directory was. Because how can you possibly get to know all these hundreds of people without a photo, even if it was 20 years ago? And I thought, well, I'd like to get involved with that because I was a programmer and I was specializing in databases at the very beginning of time. And so I suggested that maybe I could help Paul. I hadn't even met him. And then I heard that he really was needing help. And it was really just the nick of time when I got involved. And it was so delightful because, I mean, everything worked out so well because I was a Mac person too, and I knew the software, and Peter was so great, and he was so helpful and sent me long emails about what maybe, because Paul, he said, it takes so long to sort this database. And I said, well, why don't you just sort it? And he's like, sort. And looking at this whole big bookcase of programming languages that I didn't even know, and he was so serious. He was so serious, and every day I never knew whether he was going to be really ready to go or whether he was going to be really slow. And I would call Calvin, who's aide, and say, is he awake today? Because he would sort of just be asleep. And he said, he just can't sleep the night before you come. He's really worried that he can't remember things. So then we decided that we would just not tell him when I was and we got it done. Sometimes I would just go home and do a lot of it and then say, oh, look, we only have 5 more to do. And so finally we got it done. And I was just so aware of this contribution that he had made and how beloved he was here. I didn't want to be seen as someone who was coming and taking it away from him. And one night, Tony and I had dinner with Paul, and I think it was that day that I had actually taken the final printed version and given it to him and said, look, we did it, and yay. And then we had dinner that night, and I said, can you just tell me how involved do you want to be in this going forward? And he goes, you can have it all. And from then on, he was a different Paul. He was so funny. I didn't know he was funny. It was a whole different relationship. And anyway, I just loved working with him. And we told each other how we were both at the cutting edge of computer history. And so, thank you all. I heard about you all, and I love the stories.
I'm Bill Fisher, and as many of you, I think, know, up to her passing, there were several references to my stepmother, Laura Fisher. She and Paul were very close companions for the years up to that. There have been several references to Paul's intellect and his sense of humor, and I think I can combine those two in one little vignette. Paul and Laura used to watch a television program called The Big Bang Theory. If you're familiar with it, the setting is doctoral, not students, but PhDs in the various sciences, and it really kind of focuses on their personal and professional trials and tribulations. And it's a comedy show. So they would watch this, and Laura would tell us, gee, we saw The Big Bang last night, and many of the scenes were in the laboratory. And she said, you know, it's extremely funny. And then Paul would lean over to me and say, you know, that equation on the blackboard, there's an error in there. So you may have retired from being a professor, but you can't take the professor out of the boy. That's for sure. On a more serious note, my family, not just me, my sisters, and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, always enjoyed coming here and seeing Laura, but especially also seeing Paul and for what he brought to everything. very enjoyable, and we want to thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this remembrance of a really wonderful person.
We have someone, please.
My name is Dick Harter. I'm a resident of Evergreen Woods. And when my wife and I moved here 8 years ago, Paul was the grown-up in the room. And every room needs at least one grown-up. I felt like the frightened freshman I had been when I first came to Connecticut 60 years before. And he had the answers for the questions that people have, not the big questions, the little questions. How do you live here? How do you relate to people? The directory, extremely important, but not the only way to relate to people. You have dinner with people. You ask questions and people take those questions seriously. That was Paul. I miss him.
Emmy.
Paul was my uncle. He was my dad's little brother. And we lost our dad when we were in our early 20s. So my uncles, my Uncle Sayer and my Uncle Paul, they were like kind of a little bit like dads. And I was really lucky to get to know him as an adult because my mom and I would go to Fire Island. They had a running joke about, he was constantly ribbing her about how big her nose was. His nose was not exactly small. But he, and my mom actually was one of those people that turned the hose into the dining room. Through the screen door and the windows. And I think after that, family water fights were banned. But Paul, as everyone has said, could be so goofy. Ginny, when I was a child, Ginny was the only woman scientist that I knew. And that was so important to me. And I remember, when she started to decline, the way that he cared for her was so beautiful. And I remember once when she said something about, I'm afraid, it was something in the kitchen, and she said, I'm afraid I'll forget. And he's like, I'll remember. And I remember saying to him that it was so beautiful and inspiring and so loving and caring the way that he helped her and the way he cared for her. And he said, well, she cared for me all our lives, and now it's my turn. And, it was just wonderful to see that and to have that time with him, as a grown-up, and get to know him, all of the sides that everyone has talked about. So I am very sad that he's gone. And I'm very sorry for you guys that you lost your dad.
We're gonna let Pro give her remarks right there.
Turn. Paul was my brother-in-law, but when I married, I was 21 and a half and felt very old, but he was the little brother. So to me, that's how I always saw him, as the little brother. My math wasn't very good because I knew that he was 6 years younger than my husband.
I was 4 years younger, so that meant Paul was only 2 years younger, but still to me, he was the kid brother. And I brought the photo that's sitting on the table back there, that's been in my bedroom for years. And it shows the little brother as I first met him as a teenager, because my husband was 5'7". 5 and a half. Okay. Whatever. He was in the army. He was the shortest one, and often would be at the end of the row. And his other brother, Joe, was the same height. Their father was the same height. And then there's a picture that's there of Paul sitting there as a teenager, because clearly if he had stood up, he would have towered over his other brothers. And what I remember first was how much my husband Sayer loved him. He would remember crawling into Paul's crib, and Paul apparently had this assortment of stuffed animals, and the two of them would play in the crib with those animals. And somehow that love that my husband had for him always was something I knew was so important. So I was at Paul and Ginny's wedding, and of course I knew both of Paul's parents, and nothing has been said about them. But my mother-in-law had an 8th grade education. She was a brilliant woman. She and Paul had issues, no question, but she was one of the people who helped to work for Medicare. And when the bill was signed, she was there. We have a picture of her with President Lyndon Johnson. And this was, as I say, a woman with an 8th grade education. His father, Harry, was the loveliest man you'd want to meet. He worked his entire year for Western Union. And he began as a delivery boy, going on the bicycle, delivering telegrams. And then by the time he retired, he had a job, and I forget the name of it, where he could fix any machine that Western Union had. So any place in the city of Philadelphia, if a machine went down, he would do it. He also was apparently an expert telegrapher. So he would sit on the booth above the football games, and he would be transcribing Eagles games, which is how my husband got to be the Eagles fan he was, because he sometimes sat with him in that. And at the same time, he was a wonderful family man, but he also had guts. And in Western Union, they had a union that was their own union, a company union. And he was one of the ones who helped to organize a branch of one of the international unions, and was its president, and went to a convention, a national convention, months before he died. So I just thought, I'm one of the only people who knew both of the parents, and so I want to remember them today as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How many of us are on Medicare?
Everybody.
Thank you, Grandma Dora.
Thank you, Grandma Dora. Yeah.
And they shaped the whole family.
We have maybe one more remembrance from off the program.
Off the program. Well, I feel the need to defend myself from being maligned.
Would you introduce yourself, please?
Shall. My name's Scott Williams. I was born in Charlottesville. My parents, my dad was a professor at UVA. They lived below Ginny and Paul in faculty housing. In fact, David rolled out the window and landed on the grass outside my parents' window, and I blame all of that for his subsequent successes. Apparently, and I would say I've known Paul since before I knew I was knowing anything. I'm 6 months older than David. Apparently, when we were in the crib together, Paul could tell, because he would come home and say, Jenny, I can see Scott was here because I can see the bite marks on David's back. I wasn't there, that I recall, much like these much maligned water fights that I know nothing about. But we've heard all about Paul and the things he cared about, and I thought I'd bring an image of something he didn't care about. But when I talked to my youngest brother the other day, and I said I was coming here, I said, what images do you have of Paul? And we had the same one. Again, Paul cared about many things. What he didn't care about sartorial splendor until Laura came around. And my mom one day said, Laura and Paul came to visit us in Charlottesville, and he was wearing a cable knit sweater and khaki pants. And in my life, I never saw him doing so. Anyway, she had a very positive influence 8 ways to Sunday. But I thought I would bring this, which the Schatz boys may recognize. So this is a VW, vintage 1967. It's a much nicer car than Paul drove. In fact, to be clear, I would never have called them Paul and Ginny. I was called her Mrs. Schatz because that was the way I was raised. Paul, later in life, he would address me as Great Scott when I would walk through the door of their house. And I took to addressing him as fugly, which is a contraction we won't go into today. But if you imagine Paul, or you can imagine looking at his grandsons here, he was big. And he would fold himself into this never washed, never shined, always dirty VW Bug like an origami, and you would see him going down the street like this, usually driving in between us while we were playing four-square football with a million kids on the street, going through there, and how it got up the hill, because Bunker Hill was fairly steep, powered by, 3 squirrels and a chipmunk. I have no idea, but he clearly didn't care about cars. He didn't care about sartorial things, but he did care, as we've talked about here, about many things. He cared about great stereo equipment. So I heard the Beatles at their house, never at my parents' house. I heard opera. Unfortunately, I heard his singing, which is rarely good. He also, though, obviously cared about teaching. He cared about his colleagues. He cared about friends. He cared about family. And those things mattered. He also was passionate in caring about slicing the bagels safely. At Lazy Days, we had a serrated knife that he referred to as the scimitar, and you had to slice it carefully, keep your fingers out of the way, or else you would be upbraided by Paul. He also clearly cared about progressive ideas in politics, and I have him to blame, and my parents, for being a lifelong Democrat. And I would say he also cared clearly about prosecuting obnoxious, as he would say, unthinking conservatives. So anyway, my memories of Paul are things he cared about and many of the things he didn't care about. So, anyway.
thank you to all of you who were not on the program who spoke. Yes, you certainly may.
I read something from someone else earlier, and I dug out an email, and I have one Fire Island anecdote that hasn't been mentioned. Grandpa Paul was always very good about encouraging me in my scientific pursuits. I am now a third generation Dr. Schatz, and nothing makes me prouder than sharing that with both my father and uncles and my grandfather. But one time I sent out an email update that included a link to a paper I'd recently gotten published in grad school. And he replied saying, "Anna Kate, congratulations on your publication. I actually skimmed through it. It was very impressive. And I note all your other activities. Good busy." And I always appreciated how the science was so important and sharing that with him was so important. But he always did remember to note the other activities. And then one of my favorite Fire Island anecdotes that I wasn't even around for, but it's a line that I use to this day. There was a very annoying yappy dog somewhere on the island, and sound carries. So many people have screen windows, screen doors. The houses are never really closed, so you can hear a dog barking basically across the island. And one night there was a dog that just wouldn't shut up. And it was really getting on his nerves. And so at some point after, I think, several hours of this, he went out on the back deck and just yelled, "Somebody shoot the dog!" And to this day, if something loud and annoying is happening repeatedly, in my head I just go, "Somebody shoot the dog!" It's one of my favorite stories.
Thank you very much, Anna Kate. Thank you, everybody. Our next remembrance, and well, I don't know if it's exactly a remembrance, but our next contribution will come from Claudia Schatz.
Hi again. I'm back this time with some of my own words. This is a sonnet that I wrote in the fall of 2018 when we were celebrating Grandpa Paul's 90th birthday. And at that time I was in a course completely focused on the art of writing sonnets. And I have edited since 2018. I think I've gotten a little bit better in the 6 years, but this is the sonnet for Grandpa Paul that I wrote in the fall of 2018 on the occasion of his 90th birthday. As songbirds arch their necks against the wind and tilt their feathers towards the warmth of spring, as signals race from brain to churning limbs and back again with all the news they bring, as words and laughter fill telephone lines and echo with reverberations sweet, as quilted blankets, soft in wintertime, return the body's quiet, constant heat, so we come home to you, our origin, our starting point on any graph or chart. Our family makes a joyous ragtag band. To you we owe our humor and our heart. Our far-flung steps have bent to you, our core, these 90 years, and here's to plenty more. Thank you.
Well, we're going to go through multiple cleanups here. So we've come just about to the end of the memorial, and I want to again thank everybody for being here. I want to thank everybody for sharing on so many different levels and so many different ways, and I feel like Dad's up there hovering above us in the cupola. You've been very good at evoking him. Thank you. So now I'll say a few words of my own. And one of the things that I wanted to try to do was, well, anyway, hopefully we'll see if I accomplish it. So I wanted to start my remarks with something that was said many times to us by one of the wisest people I've ever known, and that was my Aunt Charlotte, Dad's sister-in-law, his brother Joe's wife. And Charlotte observed, as I said many times, "You Schatz men, too much head stuff, not enough heart stuff." And she spoke truth. I think about our home in Charlottesville, and it was filled with caring, it was filled with security, it was filled with love, and there was, as you might imagine, no shortage of intellect, sort of bursting and spurting around the house. And Dad and Mom, as you've heard, were both very talented, accomplished scientists. They took great pleasure in the life of the mind. And I've been, maybe we all do this with our parents, but I've spent a lot of time, especially since Dad died, but even before, trying to understand him and understand how he's affected me. And as I watched Dad go through final years and some difficult times, I saw this something that became very clear, which he had a very powerful drive to understand and make sense of the world around him. He did that through science, through math, through politics, through debate, through argument and observation. He really wanted to understand. And that extended very much to trying to understand himself. He, as it was alluded, that he spent some years in psychoanalysis. He worked very hard on that. He thought very deeply about it. But if you come back to what Charlotte observed, I think you'll probably agree that understanding yourself is very difficult if there's too much head stuff and not enough heart stuff. The comment that was read from Bryce Williamson, there was something in those remarks that struck me very forcefully. It was the statement about Dad's, quote, steadfast ethics and moral fortitude. And I think Peter captured a lot of this, John captured a lot of this. Dad had a really powerful, deep commitment to truth and fairness and justice. And a really powerful revulsion to inequity. And I wanted to share a couple of stories from my youth that illustrate this. The first, and Scott will remember this probably as clearly as I do. When we were entering fourth grade, we lived in Charlottesville, in a nice part of Charlottesville, and the schools. This was Charlottesville, Virginia, right? This is south of Mason-Dixon, and in fourth grade, the schools were integrated, and this involved busing, and there were kids that were being bused across town, and the upshot of it was that there was a fair amount of bullying and intimidation. Some of the kids being bussed in were a couple years older, and actually at that point had already hit their growth spurt and were just a lot. I was a little scrawny 10-year-old. And I would come home from school sometimes very upset, in tears even. And the way my parents responded to that, Mom and Dad both, was to sit me down and take me through the historical context of what was happening. They talked to me about our country's history of slavery, of racism, discrimination. They talked about why this was happening, And they did a second thing, which was they said, David, I want you to stop and think about how those kids feel. They've been torn out of their community, bussed across town. They feel alien, they feel isolated, they feel alone. It's very, very hard for them. And I just hadn't thought about that. And it had a profound effect on me. That one way they handled that completely changed or informed the way I felt about this and many related issues for the rest of my life. The second example I want to give is the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar was released in 1972. And my parents, it's already been alluded, they loved the Beatles, and they were into the current music, and they loved this new musical, Jesus Christ Superstar. And we would listen to it, and we had the lyrics, and there's a moment in the opera where Judas is criticizing Mary Magdalene and Jesus for wasting money that could have been used for the poor. And Jesus responds with the following: surely you're not saying we have the resources to save the poor from their lot. There will be poor always, pathetically struggling. And I was 15 years old, and I turned to Dad. I was 15. I knew everything. Right? I was wise, and I turned to Dad and I said, "Boy, that guy Jesus, he had it right. He had that. He was right." And my dad's response was vehement. It was as if someone had just hit this very sensitive nerve, and just this vehement, blunt, emphatic rejection. That is not true. That does not have to be true. And he told me a little bit more about why he thought that, and as I've learned more about his upbringing and the feelings and the attitude of his parents and his brothers and the mother that he continued to associate with even after this is a long story. He had been accused of having communist sympathies, and this became a big issue while he was in the army, and there was actually a whole hearing where he had to admit that he had continued to associate with his mother. So anyway, but it was a response that again powerfully influenced my views of the world and my understandings. Dad loved Shakespeare. He would have been absolutely thrilled to have a sonnet read at his memorial, and he loved. He particularly loved the sonnets, and there was a line that he loved to quote, and this is a quote from one of the early scenes in Hamlet, and it's Polonius giving advice to his son Laertes before he goes off to university, and it's a long soliloquy, but I'm just going to read one line of it because this is what mattered. This above all, to thine own self be true. That's what Dad strove to do throughout his life. And his heroism and, in a sense, his triumph wasn't perfection in that quest. It was his determination and really unyielding effort to be true to himself. It had a profound effect on his sons and others around him. I think we could feel that in many of the remarks today. And I didn't really fully appreciate it until after his death, how deeply his and Mom's influence and example influenced our being in our family life. But I'm going to return to Charlotte because the head stuff and the heart stuff, they both are very, very important. It's been alluded to previously. And as I said, Dad strove to be true to himself, and he fought the good fight. He wasn't always successful. He struggled with anxiety. He once said to me something that I still don't completely understand, and I've worked to understand. He said, "I'm not so much afraid of failure. I'm afraid of success." I'm afraid of success. And as I said, I've puzzled over that for a long time, and what did it mean? And I think what was at issue was, what was he going to allow himself to feel and experience? What would a real embracing of his own success, of which there were many, what would the embracing, the true absorption of his own and realization of his own success, what sorts of feelings would that have evoked from within him? What dangerous terrain might that have led him to tread? And I think he despite, I think he struggled to be emotionally aware and vulnerable, and to be receptive to the vulnerabilities and the fears of others. And yet, as we've heard over and over and over again, he did connect with other people in very deeply meaningful ways. So he sought for himself. He sought to be true to himself, and he struggled, and in that struggle, I think he had his triumph. He yearned for emotional connectedness. And the times when I saw him the happiest, the most carefree, were in activities or with people who drew him out of himself. So one clear example was any time he was deeply absorbed in an intellectual challenge or puzzle. But other times it was when he was surrounded by family. There were these wonderful times when I was in high school. Our house was something of Grand Central Station, and kids were coming through the house all the time, and we would have these poker games. And Scott was there for many of them. And at these poker games, sometimes Dad would just sit down at the table and join us. And what a cad. What a jokester. And he would taunt my friends, and he would bluff, and he would drive them crazy. And then sometimes he would just lose his money, and he'd be, he was just happy and carefree at those moments. And then I probably can say, I personally have never seen him happier than with the Oxford crew visiting us at Fire Island. It was a time when he just felt completely enveloped in an atmosphere of both the intellect and the heart. And he was just brought out of himself. And Graham Light, who's here, in remarks that he sent by email, one line caught my attention, particularly referring to Dad's brilliant irreverence and wicked sense of fun. And at those moments, it would really burst forth from him. And it was just sort of there was a radiance to it. And it was there despite, or maybe because of his yearning for connectedness. So Dad was an extremely powerful role model for a commitment to truth and for the search for understanding of the world and himself. Powerful role model for commitment to justice and fairness, for caring for others, and I'm going to deeply miss his guidance and just unqualified love. Thank you all so much for being here. We have one more comment?
I'm sorry, I'm Pat Harvard.
Hi,
And
Pat.
Paul and I spent 10 years together putting on the concerts. And I miss him deeply. And we actually have, this is our 30th anniversary, and we have a concert tonight at 7 o'clock. And continuing the tradition, but certainly without Paul, he was just wonderful. He really took me on because my predecessor died on the way to the Yale Hospital, and it was one of those sudden things, and there wasn't planning for what to do. But I think we have enjoyed, we now have nearly 100 subscribers for a community like this who likes classical music, though it's going to be rather light tonight. And so I just miss Paul very, very much. And he was dedicated, and I'm sure you've already said that he invented the photos directories, which we also think we can't live without. But now I like to think that we had Boris Berman at our concert. He had played at the inaugural concert here 30 years ago, and is now head of the Yale School of Piano. So it's been a long tradition, and Paul was an essential part of that. And I'm very happy to have known him.
We have some we'll have a reception now where people can just share their remembrances and catch up. And food on this side, hot drinks back in the back left corner, cold drinks back in the back right corner. So please, everybody, enjoy. And if you see some of us departing, it's because we need to get home and get ready for the next stage of the day. Thank you very much, everybody.
And Sir Payne, you too. I didn't know Paul accepted the Fire Island circumstance. It's so interesting to hear in your perception. You really dug in, having us descend on him year after year after year.